In today's module, we're going to be looking at TLS and specifically certificates, right? And why certificates are important in TLS, right? So looking at our standard model, we have the client on the left-hand side and the web server. And as part of TLS, our real goal here is to get to the point of an established secure channel. And the way we do that in TLS is the actual TLS protocol handshake, right? But in this instance, what we want to focus on here is the actual certificates, right? So what certificates do in its basic most form is it establishes something called trust for us, right? So trust is what the end goal here is of certificate. Now these certificates are installed on the actual server. Okay, so that's our certificate there. Now, once the certificate is actually installed on the web server, it kind of gives us two main elements here, right? In order to get to that trust aspects of it. The first one is that it provides us with a secure connection. And the way it actually does that is on the certificate here, there is something called a public key. So when the client is making that connection to the web server, it is encrypting that traffic using the public key. So when the web server receives that, it then uses the corresponding mathematically generated private key to decrypt that traffic. So that means only the web server is actually able to decipher that traffic. So that actually solves the first aspects of trust, which is the secure connection, right? But then the problem is when we connect to a web server, right, how do we know we're actually connecting to where we're supposed to be connecting? So that's the second problem that a certificate solves, which is the actual identity verification. So what the actual certificate here does, certificate, it actually verifies the identity of the website's owner and the domain. Okay, so this is important because it helps us to prevent domain spoofing and other attacks that impersonates a website. So when we say we're connecting to a web server, and that web server is like a banking web server, the certificate tells us, verifies that we are in actual fact connecting to some kind of banking website or something, the actual entity that says who they are. Now, the certificates, they come into actual different forms of certificates here. And without actually kind of dive deep into these certifications, I'm just going to kind of like, at a kind of like a high level, just kind of like highlight that there are actually three different types of TLS certificates, right? So there is a domain validation certificate, there is an organization validation certificate, and then there's an extended validation certificate. And really, the kind of like the main difference is that as you go towards in this direction here, is the verification of how, doing the actual checking to verify that entity is really who they're supposed to be. So really, if you look at it, the least one would be perhaps a domain validation, right? So anybody could generate a domain validation certificate, including myself, and not that much check kind of goes into it. But if we were to do like an extended validation, then a lot of checking goes into the organization, the domain, and everything else to kind of like verify that that certificate represents that entity correctly, right? Now, in order for this model to work here, right, the certificate itself comes in kind of like two major flavors here. There's the self-managed certificate, right? So we can actually go here and say self-managed. So that's the first type of one. And the self-managed certificate is something that anybody can generate, right? It's not really validated. And it kind of serves most people's purposes. And let's just say you had your own little environment, or you had some servers at home. You can create your own self-managed certificates, right? But if you want it to be, if you want to have authenticity aspects to it, then you have to use something called managed certificates. So what managed certificates actually does, it provides a little bit more complicated structure here, right? So management certificates has to be generated by a certificate authority, right? So a certificate authority is an external body that actually generates these managed certificates. And once they actually generate these managed certificates, we can then install them on the web server. And this certificate authority, and there's a number of those out there, actually verifies the entity, the domain, the business, and everything. Does all the actual checks and everything to to actually say that that certificate is valid for that entity. Now, so you can actually understand that. You can actually now begin to see that as part of this TLS protocol, in order to actually kind of get to this bit over here, and as part of the actual TLS protocol handshake, we need to, as part of that handshake, we need to establish a secure connection. We need to verify the identity, and by doing those two, we get to that established secure channel, right? Now, there is one little bit here, and I have created a separate video that talks about MTLS, right? But in this instance, we actually have the certificate actual over here. So this is our certificate over here, right? But in actual fact, we can actually have a certificate on the client side here. And what it actually basically means is that as we are actually establishing a connection in this direction, which is all about validating and verifying the actual web server, there are instances where the web server may want to validate the actual client here. And in like for example, and basically, you're authenticating in both direction here. The web, the client authenticates the web server authenticates the client. And in that kind of model here, the most common area for that is really IoT devices. So let's say the client happens to be an IoT device that's connecting to some kind of web server. The web server would want to verify or authenticate the actual client. So that's an example of actually having certificates both on the web server and on the client side. Thank you. That concludes today's module.